It's really something that I don't really have a choice but write about. I feel if I am going to write about Israel and Palestine, it's sort of like unfortunately in the texture of those places, and I suppose what I can do as an artist is to try to, because I can't, I'm not the person deciding to go on those wars, to start them. What I can do is to interrogate what they do to the human psyche, right? What they do to the place and to the people who live in it. But I think the war is present in all the characters' lives in different ways, right? Khalil, the Palestinian poet, who is one of the main characters in the book, experiences it very differently from Abigail, Adam's best friend, who, is Jewish and grows up in Tel Aviv. But war, unfortunately, is omnipresent.
Hello, this is Shop Talk with Writers, the podcast where we are curious about the story behind the book. I'm Elena Lappin, and my very interesting guest today is Eli Zuzovsky to tell us about his superb debut novel, Mazeltov. It is a queer, coming-of-age story set in Israel against the background of war, but also reflecting the stories of brokenness in a young boy's personal orbit. I noticed this book on the counter of my local Waterstones and was very intrigued by its offbeat cover featuring a young boy clownishly drawn with butterflies in his eyes, looking sad and funny and lost and beautiful. Joshua Cohen describes the book as sweet, dry, mournful, and horny. Claire Messoud finds it hilarious and heartbreaking. Eli Zuzovsky is a writer and filmmaker. Born in Israel, he now lives in New York and holds degrees from Harvard and Oxford. He was selected for the London Library Emerging Writers Program and is the winner of the 2025 Einstein Fellowship. Here is Eli Zuzovsky reading from his first novel, Mazeltov. Enjoy.
Hi, my name is Eli Zuzovsky, and I'm a writer and director. I'm the author of the novel Mazeltov, which came out from Footnote Press in the UK in June. The novel is set at a bar mitzvah party that takes place on the night of the first invasion of Gaza in 2009. And each chapter is written from a different perspective. The chapter I'll be reading from is titled The Shiksa, and it is written from the perspective of Meme, the bar mitzvah boy's grandmother. Standing on the doorstep of the house of worship, dressed in her best wool suit, Meme shuts her eyes and tells herself she will not faint. Why is this elegant, vibrant, generally stable woman trembling with agitation on such a holy Saturday? She is excellently put together, surprisingly perhaps, considering the pressures of this morning, and seems just as self-collected as on any other day. The entrance to the synagogue is virtually deserted. Everybody is inside. Everything, it seems, is happening so fast in there. People whoop and chirp and cheer and clap. Even from a distance, she can hear the building chant. The air outside is cool and strangely sour. The morning news, which she habitually makes her best effort to avoid, predicted both a rainstorm and a war. Meme has always harbored a suspicion that the two are somewhat correlated. Military operations, she has learned, rarely happen in the winter. But those that do tend to be particularly devastating for everyone involved. It is as if the cold makes men more savage. She has seen them all, the wars, in different shapes and hues. The nauseating green of years, how many years, decades, putain, in Lebanon. The yellow-brown of Egypt, dotted with burned tanks and corpses. She has never actually been there, no, thank goodness. She was married on the eve of her 18th birthday, marvelously pregnant, and barely spoke any Hebrew, so they gave her an exemption. But she's heard the stories, seen the pictures. Now, standing motionless on Frischman Street, she thinks of rain and sirens. Meme wonders which one will precede the other. Breathing suddenly becomes a task. But that is anything but new. It has much more to do with her own fragility than with the army or the weather. Even from behind the wooden doors, Meme recognizes the angelic voices, the choir that her son has hired with the money that he doesn't have. 4 brothers, not quadruplets, but thoroughly identical. There is something oddly Catholic about this lavish celebration, so unlike her son. Jews, she knows, are taught to keep their distance from this business of extravagance. But of course she hasn't said a thing, figuring she might as well enjoy it while it lasts. This merry foursome is to accompany her grandson as he partakes in the strange rite du passage, ushering him into adulthood, when at long last he becomes a man. She is half an hour late and absolutely stunning for her age. Her paprika hair, cut to the shoulders specially for the event, her suit, her suntanned skin, her whitened teeth all shine. They tell a story that the world adores about eternal youth and the wonders of persistence. She is a master storyteller. That's what everybody says. But deep inside, she recognizes that she hasn't been herself. Something isn't right with her. A certain fuzziness.
Thank you so much, Eli Zuzovsky, and welcome to Shop Talk with Writers. I don't know if you can guess why I asked you to kindly read this particular passage from the book. It was this moment when I read this particular chapter that I fell in love with the book. I liked it from the very beginning, but this is when I fell in love with it. What you've done in this book, which I've never seen done in a novel about a coming-of-age ceremony or any other so-called bar mitzvah novels, such as The Apprenticeship of Dudi Kravitz by Mordecai Richler or Portnoy's Complaint. These novels all have a great way of telling the story of a boy becoming a man and what actually happens in their lives. And they are all very sort of full of, raw stuff, sex, thoughts, and family dramas and all that. But they are so almost not narcissistic, but they're very self-centered. Your novel takes a completely, to me, revolutionary approach, and that is to show everyone else in this boy's life, and together, each one separately, combine to tell his story. And there's a sentence towards the end of the book where you say, the many characters of what you used to think of as a one-man show. This is when he's sort of, as an older young man, he's thinking back about his life. And he expresses that idea that he wasn't alone in all of this. All these characters contributed to what would turn out to be his not a one-man show. So I really want to thank you for doing that. And of course, I'm very curious how that came about.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for making this observation, which to me is really sort of the project of the novel and perhaps of my life, of my sort of creative journey. It's definitely something that I've thought about a lot. I think the novel was born essentially because of my sort of love-hate relationship with this genre, right? The coming-of-age novel. It's a genre that I love. Some of my favorite books and films are written in this vein. And I think there's a lot to admire about it. When I think about a book like Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin or the Ferrante novels, My Brilliant Friend and so on. Wonderful, wonderful books. But as you said, they usually really have one authority that sort of shapes them and guides them, one voice. And that is something that has always felt too narrow I think, almost claustrophobic. And I think most importantly, just not true to what I understand as being a person in the world. I think we're never alone. You said this before. You said he's reminded that he wasn't alone. I think we're never alone. We live under systems that perhaps make us feel like we're alone, right? Whether it's capitalism or the nation state, but I think we're always in community with others. And my understanding of myself is always intertwined. My own coming of age is always intertwined with the coming of age of the people around me. And so I wanted to write something that was capacious and expansive enough to capture that notion. And that's what I essentially try to do with this book.
Well, the characters that you introduce in all of their own brokenness are your main protagonist's close friends, his parents separately, a cousin, a Palestinian poet who plays a huge role in the narrative in a very surprising way. Each one, even a DJ at the party. Every single one of them has a voice. And as your background is in film and theater, I was wondering, is the habit sort of creating these very live voices something that you've carried over into writing fiction, or was that a completely separate process?
Absolutely. I think it has a lot to do with my background and my work to this day in those media. I think I'm a very voice-driven writer, and it actually takes me a while, for instance, when I came up with the idea for this novel, I knew I wanted it to be set at a bar mitzvah party. But it actually took me a while to start writing because I really needed to hear those voices. I really sort of need to know what the exact texture of a character's consciousness is before I start writing it. And of course, there's a lot of discovery in the writing itself, but I needed to hear those voices. And only when I started hearing them clearly was I able to actually sit down and write. And I think what's interesting about this book, and this wasn't necessarily something intentional on my end, is that there's actually quite a lot of echoes. So the different voices echo one another, and you hear echoes of Meme, the grandmother, in the mother, and there's of course a very sort of fraught relationship between the two of them, but still there's some kind of vocal overlap. You hear echoes of Adam's father, who he has a very complicated relationship with, in Adam himself, and so on. And I think, again, to go back to your question from before, to me, that's what being a person is like. Selfhood is not a one-person show. It's always an ensemble show. It's always with others, and being alive is something we do together. We don't do it alone, and that's something that I love about film and theater, unlike fiction writing, that you get to collaborate with others. You get to, and honestly, I think this is partly how I've been able to keep doing what I've done, just through combining this more solitary work of writing on my own, and then knowing that at some point I'll be in the room with others, whether it's, in a rehearsal room or working on a play, or on set with my cast and crew working on a film. I really need to know that that's in my future to write something, because otherwise I just, I get too lost in this solitude of writing, which is really too much for me.
Another book that your novel it didn't remind me of it, but it made me think of it, surprisingly, actually, is Bonjour Tristesse by Françoise Sagan, which was written in 1954. And it's it was actually written by her as a teenager. And it's about a teenage girl who interferes in her father's hedonistic life with her own sort of hedonism, and becomes very destructive. And it is a novel that's full of broken people doing even more broken things. And it's very, very sort of existentialist, I should say, in this very sort of post-war French way. And I don't think it's an accident that that novel was written in the shadow of the war, not too many years after World War II. And your novel is also written in the shadow, not only of the war that it takes place, during the time of, but also the previous wars. So, for example, Adam's father has clearly been damaged. His mental health has been severely damaged by the Lebanon war. How much of that thinking about wars has come into writing this book very consciously for you?
So I grew up in Tel Aviv in Israel, and I left when I was 21. And, we have our own Shakespeare in Israel. He's called Hanoch Levin. He's a very well-known playwright, and he's a writer I admire. He had this saying that in Israel we have 5 seasons: fall, winter, spring, summer, and war. And so I think war is very much part of the rhythm of everyday life, unfortunately, in Israel and Palestine. It's when I think back to my childhood, there are so many moments that, that when I think about them now, they seem absurd and so profoundly violent. I grew up, against the backdrop of the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, and things like, sentences like, "Oh, don't take the bus today because one was exploded yesterday downtown," were completely normal, were something that was just present in my life even as a kid. So I think that's unfortunately inescapable for Israelis, not to mention for Palestinians who, are subjected to extreme violence and occupation, and of course the onslaught that we're seeing now in Gaza. And many, many others before. So, it's really something that I don't really have a choice but write about, I feel. If I'm going to write about Israel and Palestine, it's sort of like, unfortunately, in the texture of those places. And I suppose what I can do as an artist is to try to, because I'm not the person deciding to go on those wars, to start them. What I can do is to interrogate what they do to the human psyche, right? Mm-hmm. What they do to the place and to the people who live in it. And yes, of course, Yishai, Adam's father, is a prime example of that. Someone who is profoundly broken, probably suffering from some sort of PTSD. But I think the war is present in all the characters' lives, in different ways, right? Khalil, the Palestinian poet, who is one of the main characters in the book, experiences it very differently from Abigail, Adam's best friend, who, is Jewish and grows up in Tel Aviv. But war, unfortunately, is omnipresent.
But for you, as you were writing this, when you said you left Tel Aviv at 21, and in the novel, Adam, at some point, realizes that he's yearning for the forbidden, so to speak, diaspora. But diaspora has actually been present in his life since his childhood, since the beginnings, through his grandmother, through, family history. How would you explain that emotional connection? Because there's a beautiful sentence in the book, which I can't remember exactly, but it's something along the lines of Adam thinking, I'd like to go back in time. Going back in time, is that going back to a time that was perhaps also awful, but not this way, difficult, but not exactly like this? Is it about this particular time that he's growing up in, becoming unbearably hard, and is escaping from it by going abroad the only way to continue?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that I've asked myself in my life over and over. I think for Adam, first of all, he clearly romanticizes the diaspora to an unhealthy extent. He's thinking about Gertrude Stein and Sigmund Freud. And there's even a sentence in that same chapter where it's like, I forget exactly what the wording is like, but it's like the cities that were never hostile to the Jews, you know, which is obviously ironic. So there's that. I think the ways in which he sees the diaspora, and I'm saying this as someone who has lived in the diaspora for almost a decade now, are at the very least exaggerated. But I would also say that I think the question for Adam and for me and for a lot of people that I know is the price, I think, is the price that we pay, the ethical price. I sometimes talking to my own loved ones, some of whom still live in Israel, and, whether it's family or friends, people who say things like there are no innocent people in Gaza. To me, it begs the question of is this the price of living in such a place? Is this the price of the ethical price that we pay for living in Israel? That one can find oneself behaving in this way or thinking in this way. And to me, there's something almost un-Jewish about that. To me, a sentence like that goes against my entire understanding of what being Jewish is all about. And so I think that is the question, that is definitely something that is present in Adam's life from a very young age, and was also present in my own life. I can tell you that this is something that comes up in therapy a lot. But I'm someone who kind of always knew he would leave Israel. From a very, very young age, people around me said that I would leave. And I'm not talking like 12, 13, like much, much earlier. And that's kind of odd, it's not really something that you say about a kid. I don't know.
Why do you think, why did they say that about you?
The question of my life. I don't know. It's a little bit like the chicken and the egg, right? I don't know if they said it because there was something about me, that made them say it, or maybe, it's the other way around and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy that I ended up leaving. But, and I wonder also if it has something to do with being queer, which is interesting because at least Tel Aviv, where I grew up, is considered very queer friendly. Although we don't have gay marriage or anything like that. But I still think that there's something deep about queerness that goes against the grain of Zionism and of masculinity in Israel. And that's definitely something that I felt about myself from a very young age, and that I think Adam struggles with as well, that he can't quite adhere to that expectation of what being an Israeli man is or should be like.
You are incredibly young. I mean, are you even 30?
I just turned 30.
Okay. So then one looks at the summary of your achievements for your incredibly young age. I can read them off, but anyone who buys your book or looks you up will find that you've, graced both Harvard and Oxford with your creative presence and other achievements as well. Frank question, just an honest question. Give me an honest answer, Eli. Are you a genius?
Definitely not. I think it's
And if not, what's going on here?
Well, I don't know. I think ever since I can remember, I have been looking for ways to make art, which, as you know, is not the most lucrative enterprise in the world. And somehow my life has worked out in such a way that the places you mentioned have enabled me to do so. By which I mean I've just left Oxford officially, and it's been those places that where I've had funding, which has just allowed me to keep writing and directing and making my work sort of outside the sphere of influence of capitalism, which is now changing because I'm starting my real life at 30. But it's those, again, unfortunately, almost like nature reserves, and I don't mean this in an idealizing way. They're not ideal places, but they're just, if you have funding, like I was fortunate enough to have, you get to just concentrate on the work in front of you, and that's a tremendous privilege that, you know, I will forever be grateful for. But it's only been in those places that I've managed to find that. And what's going to happen now, I don't know. I've just finished my PhD, so so I'll have to figure something out. But
and what was your PhD on?
So my PhD was, I don't know if you know, in the UK they have practice-led PhD, so sort of like practical PhDs, and mine was at the Ruskin, which is the art school at Oxford. It was in fine art, and I was specifically looking at the Israeli pavilion at the Venice Art Biennale, which, as you may know, is sort of like the Olympics of the art world, where different countries have pavilions, and every other year they send an artist to represent them. So my project was basically an oral history of the Israeli pavilion in Venice, and explicitly sort of thinking about it through the lens of shame, and also a screenplay that I wrote that I'm hoping to turn into a film one day.
I love the very sort of intimate, kind of almost all-knowing, but very innocent as well, understanding or sense that you show in your novel for childhood and, you know, for growing up. And you begin your novel by quoting the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, which I will quote: "God pities the kindergarten children, the school children he pities less, and the grown-ups he pities not at all." Why did you choose this quote? I mean, I can guess, but tell me.
I think it encapsulates something deep about coming of age, at least the way I've experienced it. And I think it has a lot to do with brokenness, a term that you mentioned before. I think, and again, this is only speaking from my own experience, but when you're a kid, you're not very cognizant of how broken the world is, or at least I wasn't. And again, I grew up in a profoundly broken place like Israel. And so, for instance, you idealize your parents, right? You see them as sort of perfect, flawless characters. And as you grow older, the picture changes and you start seeing the cracks. And so to me, the quote captures something about that. The sort of, you feel as an adult, or at least I do, less mercy because you're much more exposed to the brokenness of the world. But what I hope for myself and for Adam and you know, for everyone else in the book and in the world is that we can see the beauty in the brokenness. And this brings me actually to another quote by Leonard Cohen. I don't know if you know his song Anthem. Do you know that song?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so you know, there's the quote, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And if I can put those two quotes together, I think to me that's what being an adult, being a person in the world is all about. Sort of being able to find the light in those cracks that are always there, because everything is broken, and that's a foundational idea of Judaism as well. The broken vessels in the Kabbalah, for instance, or the glass that we break at weddings, at Jewish weddings, that is supposed to commemorate the destruction of the temple, brokenness is all around us, so we might as well start seeing the light and the beauty in it.
Did you write this novel in English?
I did. It started as my undergrad thesis, which I wrote in the States. Mm-hmm. It was much shorter back then, but yes, I wrote it completely in English. And
so I found that interesting because you sent me a short film of Mazeltov. And what was really striking about the film from the beginning, the different languages. So there's Arabic at some point, there's a lot of Hebrew, there's French between the grandmother and Adam. There's all of that. And I was just wondering how languages have influenced your growing up in Israel, actually.
So I grew up speaking Hebrew, and I believe I started learning English when I was maybe 8 or 9, around that age. But it has always been a language that I have found more appealing as a writer, because I think it's much more elastic and dynamic. And Hebrew, we speak modern Hebrew today, but it's, of course, it comes from ancient Hebrew, and to me it feels like it's a beautiful, beautiful language, but it's a very heavy one, and it's one that I associate with my upbringing, with the Bible, with the occupation. And I think finding myself in English was actually quite liberating, as a writer, but also as a person, because, I've lived outside Israel for almost a decade now. And I think it also has a lot to do with gender, because I don't know if you know this, but Hebrew is heavily gendered. The poet Yonah Volach, the Hebrew poet Yonah Volach, defined the language as a sex maniac. Hebrew is a sex maniac, she said. And I think it is, to some extent. It's a language where everything and everyone has a gender, which doesn't exist in English. And to me, there's something so beautiful about that. It's a simple fact, but it does change a lot. And then, of course, there were other languages when I was growing up around me, whether it's Arabic, which, is omnipresent in Israel, because 21% of the population of Israel is actually Palestinian, and French, which interestingly was my grandmother's mother tongue, even though my grandmother is Italian. When she was very young, she went to a nunnery where they only spoke French. So that's the language that I think she feels most comfortable in, and that's the language that we sometimes speak between us. And she taught me French, actually. And that was, again, another window to another world, another self even. And in fact, the first place that I moved to after I left Tel Aviv was Paris, was France. And that was also where I came out. So I think it's all there, it's a language, right? But it's much more than that. It's sort of like a way out of an old self, another possibility.
So was your therapy in Hebrew or English or French?
My therapy is in English.
Okay. If I could vote for a prequel and a sequel for your book, so I would love a prequel about the grandmother, like her whole life. That one chapter where she speaks is so powerful, and it connects everything. But one wants to know so much more about her. Everything is hinted at and beautifully told, but she is such a fully realized character, and her story is so amazing that I think you could write a lot more about her. I would love to read that. And then as a sequel, couple of options. I'd love to hear more about the Palestinian poet in New York.
Khalil, yeah.
Yeah. Have you read or have you heard of the Hebrew novel Limassol by Yishai Sarid?
Yes, of course.
So there's a Palestinian poet as a very important character in it as well. And, I think it's interesting. Whether you've written your book in English or in Hebrew or in Chinese, it is an Israeli novel, and all its themes are from the place where you grew up. And I think it's just really fascinating that a Palestinian poet plays such an interesting role in your narrative, as
I
well
haven't.
as in.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't read that one novel, but I can definitely say that I was writing against a certain tradition
Yeah,
in Hebrew literature, in Israeli literature, that
contemporary, you mean?
yeah, I mean, Hebrew literature, unfortunately, is not very old. It's only been around for about a century or so, but I mean, modern Hebrew. But I definitely, Palestinians appear throughout
Yeah.
Israeli and Hebrew literature, but I often get the sense, and again, I haven't read the Sarid novel that you mentioned, but I often get the sense that they're not fully fledged humans, and that they're often fetishized, or they're sort of made to represent something deep about the main Jewish Israeli character, which perhaps you can say about Khalil to some extent. But I worked very hard to make sure that he's a person, which is ridiculous to say, but I think, it is. I wanted him to have his own sense of self, and in so many Israeli books and films, the Palestinian character, especially in gay Hebrew Israeli literature, the Palestinian character is sort of made to play the more sort of repressed role, coming from a more conservative, traditional society, etc. And in this book, I think it's interesting that the roles are sort of reversed, that Khalil, the Palestinian poet, is much more at ease with himself compared to Ben, the character he's sort of like in conversation with in the chapter where he's introduced. And Ben is an Israeli soldier, a paratrooper, and he's the one who is repressed, who is sort of brimming with violence, and who is not comfortable in his own skin. So I'm definitely in dialogue with those writers, and of course with Palestinian writers as well, like Said Kashua, Anton Shamas, and others.
Said Kashua is a very interesting case. I actually met him and knew him quite well a long time ago. And yeah, that's a whole different subject, but I understand what you're talking about. It's very interesting. You also draw on religious sources. So the father becomes quite religious and quite sort of obsessed with Kabbalah. And at some point, you talk about the concept of, it's called Tzimtzum, actually, but God made a hole so that he could create everything else. He had to withdraw, the withdrawal. He had to withdraw from the world so that he could actually create everything else without himself in it. Is religion something that you've thought about a lot, or is it just something that you're fascinated by other people being involved in, but it's not really for you?
I think a little bit like war. If you grow up in a place like Israel, it's unavoidable. It's in the air. And I grew up completely chiloni, as we say in Hebrew. I grew up completely secular in Tel Aviv, but religion was always there. If I think it's changing now a little bit, but when I was young, you couldn't take the bus to the beach on Saturday because there's no public transport because of Shabbat. And on Yom Kippur, no one drives because of the fast. Even if you don't fast yourself, I don't think it's a law, but it's sort of, that's the custom. And the roads are empty. And I think that's something that always baffled me as a kid. And I almost felt like I had some kind of opposition to religion at large, and to Judaism specifically. It created this sense of antagonism almost. And the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, most of them don't serve in the army. And and most other Jews do. And so there's this sense of inequality sometimes. That I think I felt a lot of antagonism toward religion, and a lot of secular Jews in Israel I know really feel this sense of, defining themselves against religion. And only when I left Israel was I able to perhaps take a step back and start looking at religion differently. And it's something that I'm still sort of trying to undo in my mind. But I don't think religion has to be like that. I don't think religion has to involve sort of like forcing your customs onto someone else, the way it's done in Israel, for instance. I think, as I said, I've lived outside of Israel for 9 years, more or less, and I've never felt more Jewish here in the diaspora, and I've really been able to sort of learn more about. I'm not religious at all, but I'm deeply Jewish, and I feel very connected to those stories, those texts, including the religious ones, to the Kabbalah. I've almost been able to reclaim them. And it's not as if I tried to include them in the book intentionally, but I think they were just there. They were just around me, and they feel important.
I think you've just done a fantastic job. This is an absolutely brilliant novel, and I hope many, many people read it. Thank you so much, Eli, for writing it. And thank you for joining us on Shop Talk with Writers.
Thanks for having me. It's very, very kind of you, and it's been such a pleasure.
You are listening to Shop Talk with Writers. Our guest today was Eli Zuzovsky. His debut novel, Mazeltov, is published by Footnote Press, an imprint of Bonnier Books. Coming up soon on Shop Talk with Writers, Jamel White, Tessa Hadley, William Boyd, and more. I'm Elena Lappin. Thank you for listening.